everybody, welcome to chapter 4. You've successfully made it through the very first unit test, but I don't really want you to get a false sense of security. I feel like that first unit, chapters 1, 2, and 3, only 2 of those had medical terms, so usually the first test is kind of the highest scoring one. With that said, that leads us into chapter 4. This unit is going to contain chapter 4, 14, and 15 all together, and there's some pretty heavy duty chapters, so you're going to be kind of flooded with medical terms. And I gotta say, I love the integumentary system, but in my personal opinion, this is probably the hardest and possibly most boring chapter out of the entire textbook. That's just my personal opinion. For those of you who are going to be future dermatologists, this is totally for you. But I just want you to mentally strap yourselves in to learn a whole lot of conditions about a whole lot of different things that can go wrong with your skin. So here we go. Here are just some intro fun facts. Sorry, I've hidden my face at this point just because I don't want to block any of the info, but I read these and I kind of get creeped out just a little bit. Every month we get a whole new layer of skin, and we actually shed about 40 pounds of skin in our life. That's a little crazy. And your eyelids are made of skin, obviously, and that's the thinnest part in your whole body. An average adult, give or take, has about 20 square feet of skin. It is your largest organ in your whole body, so we need to take care of it, and that also means that there's a lot of things that can go wrong with it. So first, we're just going to kind of orient you to the general anatomic structures of the integumentary system, so that way when we put medical terms to it, you will kind of have a basis for reference. What does the integumentary system do? Step 1, be able to say integumentary, but just fancy word for skin system. And if you think about what the skin does for you, it protects you from, harmful invaders like bacteria or other organisms. It's a physical barrier. Just as it holds things out, it also holds things in. So it prevents water loss. It also acts as a barrier of protection from UV light. So when you're out, tanning or going into the sun, it kind of protects you from that UV radiation to a point. It also has provided other things like helping you regulate your body temperature. If you think about when you get really cold, you start shivering. If you're hot, you start sweating. Those are all integumentary system functions. And it also makes vitamin D, which is another one of those essential vitamins that we need, and you get that by going out into the sun. All right, so I said it's basically the skin system, which is that main component, but there are other things involved. So your nails are considered part of the system, so is your hair, and then there's going to be a couple glands that are associated with it, like your sweat glands, for example, and we're going to go into it in a bit. So here's the key picture that goes along with skin usually. It's the same one from your book. I am not going to make you memorize this crazy picture. It's important to know some key parts, but I'm not going to make you know the nitty-gritty of where every single thing is. If you've had anatomy before, then maybe you are already tuned into what all of these structures are. But just take a look. We're going to talk about and give medical terms to a bunch of these things, but I think the picture might be a little intimidating. All right. So the epidermis, there's going to be, what we will find is kind of 2 layers of skin and then below. The epidermis is that outer layer. And that's when, when you look down at your arm, that's the skin that we see. It is composed of keratin, which is kind of a protein that is hard, and it's that kind of outer layer of the skin that flakes off. And it can be fairly thick. If you've ever, for example, cut yourself without bleeding, you'll notice in the picture there's no blood vessels in that outer layer, then you're really just cutting through that epidermis. Below that is the dermis. If you didn't know, epi means above, so that's why the outer layer is called the epidermis, and then what we call the true skin, where those blood vessels and, hair follicles and sweat glands are all located, that's called the dermis. It's the inner layer of the skin. All right. The glands that we're going to be talking about are going to be the sweat glands and the oil glands. And of course, they have medical, fancier terms that go with them. So the sweat glands are called sudoriferous glands. And you can kind of see them in the picture as these, I don't even know how to describe it, maybe a pile of whipped cream kind of, or shaving cream, but it's a tiny coiled tube-like structure, and then they come and pop out through pores on the skin's surface. So that way when you get hot, you can release sweat. They also like to get clogged and cause skin problems. The oil glands are called your sebaceous glands, and that's because they secrete oil, which in medical terms is called sebum. And they secrete oil both into your hair follicles, where your hair shaft goes through the dermis. So where it happens to poke through, mostly for lubrication purposes, it secretes oil. But that's also why if you don't wash your hair for a while, then it starts to get kind of oily. And if you think about it on your face, then you can get acne as well. There are a few accessory structures of the skin that kind of go along with this, and they've been mentioned already. But obviously we have the hair, because it is poking right through the dermis and epidermis. And this is composed of keratinized cells. So the hair follicle kind of produces that, and then it shoots through the dermis and epidermis. We also have nails that actually originate in your epidermis. If any of you have ever been fortunate enough to close your finger in a door or some other reason lose your nail, it will grow back, but there's also no blood usually involved because it comes from the epidermis. And obviously I would hope you realize that they are on your fingers and your toes. So now that you got a general gist of what the key pieces of the system are, now we're going to put some medical parts to those and build words from there. So in your book, the very first table you will find is going to be on page 87, and these are the combining forms. You'll notice that there are 3 different combining forms that all mean skin. So cutaneo is really used for talking about like subcutaneous, meaning under the skin. It's not used a whole lot outside of that. Dermo and dermato, both of those mean skin also, but I always think of like a dermatologist and so on. So we'll get to some terms that's more a little bit used for. Or you think of epidermis and dermis. Hydro, this is why spelling is very important, because hydro with a Y means water. In this case, hydro with an I means sweat. So it's loosely like water if that's how you want to remember it. So there's going to be conditions of too much sweating. Everyone's known someone that's probably an excessive sweater and so on. Kerato means horny tissue. It sounds weird, but it pretty much just means hard tissue. So when you think of how hard your dermis is and that your hair and nails are made out of keratin, that's where it comes from. 2 super hard combining forms to pronounce, both mean nail. We have anico and unguo. 9 out of 10 times you're going to use the first one, anico. Unguo is going to pop out once or twice as we talk about words. Sebo, if you think about sebum and the sebaceous glands, that's where this comes from. Sebo means oil. So just as a little guide for your own self, on that same page in your book, there's a diagram. I think I put it on the printout diagrams just for you to kind of label and have for yourself. This is as in-depth as a picture as I would give you for the skin. But see if you can go through and tell yourself what the combining forms are for each one of these. I'll give you a minute. So as we just talked about, in number 1, the horny tissue, that's that hard outer portion, so that's the keratin, so kerato would be the combining form. Hair is going to be something that we haven't really talked about in here, but we'll get to. So I'm not really sure why it's in there as a word. But then we have skin, and that's got your 3 pieces. So we have dermato, dermo, and cutaneo. Sebaceous glands is going to be sebo. Sudoriferous, or your sweat glands, think of sweat as being wet, so hydro with an I. All right, so this brings us to combining forms that aren't really talking about the structures, but really go along with it in terms of what's going on with the skin. So auto means self. You might have learned that from other classes or your life up to this point. Bio, like biology, means life, so the study of life would be biology. Conio means dust. So a lot of times there could be different forms of dust in the air, and that could get into your skin, or you could breathe it in, so that's why we have that. Crypto, if you think about something being cryptic, it's hidden. So we're going to find instances of things hidden. Hetero, like heterozygous, means different. If we're thinking back to biology once upon a time. Or other. Myco means fungus. So again, pointing out, in the last unit we had myo, if you just removed the C, and that meant muscle. But now we have myco, and that means fungus. So gross but true, you can have different kinds of fungal infections of the skin. Necro means death of the cells, so I always think of that flesh-eating bacteria, the necrotizing fasciitis. Sounds like a couple Grey's Anatomy episodes. Pachio means thick, which is why, for example, elephants and rhinoceri, are called pachyderms because they have such thick skin. But you could have thick hair, for example, and have that as a term. Rhytido means wrinkles. So when you're talking about doing surgery to remove wrinkles, for example, also known as a facelift, you could call it a rhytidoplasty. Staphylo and strepto, you might have heard before. Staphylo and strepto are the physical appearance of different bacteria usually. So staphylo are the little grape-like clusters, whereas strepto are twisted chains. And then last but not least, zero means dry. So if you have dry skin, for example, then you would come up with this word. Take a moment, I would say, go through exercise 4 or 5, get a good idea of using these words at least once, because then we're going to go through the prefixes and suffixes. And then at that point, you should be able to build all of the words that are from word parts in this chapter. We're now to the prefixes. There's not a whole lot, and I feel like some of them are common sense. For example, epi means above or on, so the epidermis is on top of the regular layer of skin. Intra means within. I think in the first chapter, just as an example, we had intravenous for within the vein. Para means beside or around. It also means beyond or abnormal, but for really what we're going to talk about, it means kind of like adjacent to or next to. Per means through. So for example, if we have percutaneous, that means through the skin. Sub means under. So if we had subcutaneous, then that means you would go under the skin. And trans means through, across, beyond. So in that regard, per and trans do both mean through. It's just one of them is used in certain terms a little bit more than others. This brings us to the suffixes. And I know you've been getting a lot of suffixes, but it's really setting you up because the entire rest of the book continues to use these same suffixes. A at the end of a word doesn't actually change the meaning really in any way. It just turns whatever it is into a noun. I'm trying to think. For example, xeroderma would be the condition of dry skin. That A there at the end is really meant to turn it into a noun or turn it into a condition instead of an action, for example. Coccus has to do with the shape of a bacteria. So coccus has to do with berry-shaped. So that's when you can combine it with staphylo or strepto, depending on what kind of shape those bacteria are in. Ectomy means removal. So you're going to be removing something that's going to be universal for all of the different chapters of the book. Ia, and that means a condition or an abnormal state. So it might not necessarily be a full-blown disease, but it's some kind of condition that you have at that point. Itis means inflammation. I always think of appendicitis for inflammation of your appendix, but if you think in the grand scheme of your body, lots of different things can be inflamed. Malacia is number 6 there. Malacia means softening. So sometimes harder structures can become diseased and get softer. We'll see that in a couple of different things. Opsy means a viewing or view of. So I think of an autopsy or a biopsy. Phagia. This is a little bit different than what we've seen previously in the other unit where we had plagia. This is phagia, and when you're saying them, they sound a lot alike, but they are spelled differently, which is another reason that spelling is so important. In this case, phagia means eating or swallowing. And I always think of, it seems weird and it's going to get a gross term when we get to it, but nail biters, myself included sometimes. You're technically eating your nails, so you would use phagia. Plasty means a surgical repair. So we're going to see that when we get to those surgical terms. This is really that first chapter that we're going through all the different types of terms. Rhea, always think of diarrhea first, but rhea means a flow or discharge. Please note that there are 2 R's, R-R-H-E-A, and there's going to be, in this context, think of flow or discharge of sweat or oil. Last on the list is tome, and that's another surgical term. That's the instrument that is being used to cut. So if you're doing some kind of plasty surgical repair, your instruments could be suffixed with tome. That's a lot. Take a moment, look at exercise 8, exercise 9, see if you can, wrap your brain around the prefixes and suffixes, and then when you're ready, go ahead, hit play again. We're going to move on to all of the diseases and disorders that put these parts together. A final note before we move on, like I mentioned, the suffix a changes something into a noun, but it doesn't have a meaning in and of itself. So if I said pachydermia, then that would mean harder skin. If I said xeroderma, then that would mean dry skin. I could also say erythroderma. If we remember back to the last unit, erythro is a color. It means red. So if your skin is, excessively red or carries an excessively red tone to it. You could also have leukoderma for white skin, or xanthoderma for yellow skin. Xanthoderma is actually, we'll learn later on, is another term used for jaundice. I think some of you have heard that before, where your skin turns yellow because you're having some liver issues. Review question. Which of the following means eating or swallowing? Looking at these, you should be picking B, phagia. We are now to the actual diseases and disorders that put all the word parts together. But don't worry, sadly there's going to be quite a list of ones that are not built from word parts. Okay. So looking at these, this is going to be combining different parts from this chapter and the ones that have come before it. So just if you see something in part of one of these words that you don't immediately recognize from, this PowerPoint, for example, then that means it has come before. So we probably covered it in chapter 2 or chapter 3 at this point. Just bringing your attention to a couple of these. I don't really feel like I need to go through every single one because we've gone through the different parts. But we have derma and dermato kind of interchanged in different ones. When you're going to write these words, great if you are 100% certain of which one goes where. Sometimes it's hard to know, so as long as you are using a word part that means the right thing, then I won't discount you any points for that. But one example would be dermatoconiosis. Osis is abnormal condition. And then you go back, abnormal condition of the skin. But we still have conio. So that abnormal condition of the skin caused by dust. We can have tumors of the skin. So we have dermatofibroma. So that would be a fibrous tumor of the skin. Let's see. You can have smooth skin, which would be leoderma. You can have different colored skin, which I kind of covered on the previous slide. You can have nail issues, which is why we have all of those onycho words. For example, onychocryptosis literally means a condition of an abnormal condition of a hidden nail. What that translates to in layman's terms would be an ingrown nail, one that's growing so that you can't actually really see it. If you have soft nails, then you could have onychomalacia. If you have a fungal infection of your nails, you can have onychomycosis. If you're a nail eater, then that's where you get onychophagia. I put a little asterisk next to paranchia because it's one example where the A on para as a prefix has been dropped because onycha or onycho has a vowel in the beginning. So that's one example of where it just kind of has been dropped. But that whole word, paranchia, means a diseased state around the nail for some reason. Seborrhea. Rhea is that excessive discharge, in this case of sebum or oil. So for those people that have oily skin, seborrhea would be what we would call that, and so on. So take a moment, especially with these words, exercise 11 or exercise 12, page 93, 94. Take some time to really work through breaking apart these words and what they mean before you continue. As I mentioned before, paranchia, the A got chopped off. It doesn't happen all the time, but because the word root started with a vowel in this case, it just got taken off to sound a little bit more flowy. Some example pictures. Dermatitis, is actually pretty common, and there's different types of dermatitis. One common one is contact dermatitis. So that's, something rubbing on your skin causing inflammation. In this picture, it could be from your pants button, for example, or maybe a watch. It's happened to me with my watch before. If you get kind of sweaty and your watch is rubbing on your skin, eventually you might get some kind of dermatitis from that. The other one is seborrheic dermatitis. So this has to do with the oily skin. So sometimes the excessive oil on the skin can cause you to break out, makes your skin inflame, all kinds of fun stuff, especially for a teenager. To review before moving forward, the left picture, gross I know, but fairly common, a fungal infection of the nail. Thinking back to what those mean, abnormal condition, we always start defining at the end, would be osis. Nail, there are multiple words for nail, but we're pretty much going to use onycho. That's a very hard one to spell, so make sure you keep looking that up. O-N-Y-C-H-O. And then fungus is myco, M-Y-C-O. Number 2 there, you can see is diseased state around the nail. That's that word that we've been talking recently about, parenchyma. Okay, so everything up to this point is in your flashcards. Not the full words, but all of those word parts are there for you. Now we get to these words, and this is really our first time getting full-blown medical words that are not from word parts. And it's going to be tricky, and there's a lot of them. If you're a flashcard person, please make flashcards for these. If you are not a flashcard person, then do whatever you need, whether it's the Quizlets, listening to me talk about these, or so on. But these ones are not really easily broken down. You're going to have to straight memorize them. And they do get a little tricky. So kind of going through, an abrasion is any kind of scrape on the skin. So you rubbed up against something and it kind of scraped a layer off your skin. It's not a cut. It's not a bruise. We'll get to those. It's just kind of a scraping away of the skin. You scraped your knee falling down, that kind of thing. An abscess is a collection of pus in one area. Many reasons that can happen, but that's what it is. Acne, you guys are teenagers. You know what acne is. But the reason we get acne is really that the sebaceous glands become inflamed or infected or whatever. So they create acne as a result. The next word is actinic keratosis, if I can pronounce that correctly. And that is where you're out in the sun too long. And what happens is then you get kind of that extra rough, because it's got kerato, meaning horny tissue. So if you're out in the skin too long, you might get patches of kind of extra hard skin. And excuse me, it might lead to eventual skin cancer if you're not careful. Albinism, or if someone is an albino, then that is a congenital condition where they're missing pigment in the skin. The pigment that is missing is called melanin, and that's really what allows our skin to turn darker in the sun, but that pigment is also in the hair, which is why albinos have white hair, and it's in the eyes, which is why albinos have reddish tinted eyes. This brings me to basal cell carcinoma, abbreviated BCC. A carcinoma, as we learned in chapter 2, is a cancerous tumor. I guess as skin cancer is involved, this is, I guess, the good one to have. It's a still malignant tumor, but it comes out of the epidermis. It usually doesn't spread. So usually in this case, they can remove it and you're okay. It rises from excessive sun exposure. So if you are out in the sun too long, this could be one result. So a lot of people get it on their shoulders, on their nose. If you didn't know, Australia has the highest rate of skin cancer in the world because of the ozone hole, and so they're getting the highest percentage of UV radiation. And this brings us to the next word, candidiasis. It's a mouthful. Most of the time, doctors and nurses just call it thrush, but it's a fungal infection that infects the skin and the mouth. But it's a yeast fungal infection. If you didn't know, yeast is a fungus. And when it begins to overgrow in areas, then it can cause an infection. It's pretty common in infants and young children too. Okay, next we get to one silly word, carbuncle. And that is a group of boils, which I'm going to skip over to the word furuncle, because that is an individual boil. What is a boil? Well, it's kind of a little nodule on your skin or a little bump, and that's caused by a staph infection in your hair follicle. So a boil can arise, it's kind of like acne that's not on your face. Your hair follicle gets infected and can cause a little bump. If you have one of those, it's called a furuncle. If you have a collection or a group of them, then it is called a carbuncle. I guess they're carpooling? I don't know. But whoever came up with these words is silly. Next we have cellulitis, inflammation of the skin and the subcutaneous tissue. It can be for a bunch of different reasons. Most of the time it's some kind of infection. But it makes your skin hurt, it makes it warm, it swells, it gets red. It's more of a generic term. Contusion is a fancy word for a bruise. Before we had an abrasion where that's a scrape. This is really where there's no break in the skin, but you do get that broken blood vessel discoloration. So, you fell and bumped something, and that would be a contusion. The next word is eczema. It's spelled a little funny, but that is not infectious. It's not an infection, but it is an inflammatory skin condition. Pretty common among a lot of people, but it usually allows you to have dry skin. It can be red, gives you little itching and blisters sometimes. There's special creams that commonly get prescribed for people with eczema. Fissure is the next word. It's just a slit or crack-like sore in the skin. A lot of times this happens maybe in, Wisconsin winter. You haven't been moisturizing your hands, you get a little crack in the skin. That would be a fissure. I already covered a furuncle. Gangrene. I feel like you've heard this before. It's where an area of tissue dies. And most of the time it's because the blood supply is cut off after a bacterial infection. So you get some kind of super nasty bacterial infection and you have to cut off blood supply, and then that area of tissue dies. It's a form of necrosis or tissue death. I'm sure you could Google some nasty pictures of that. Herpes, automatically think of STD, but it does go in the skin chapter as well because it can give you cold sores. Cold sores are from the herpes simplex 1 virus. It can give you fever blisters, other things like that. If you've ever had a cold sore, that's what that's called. Impetigo is the next one, and that gives you a superficial skin infection by little pustules. So again, you get little raised bumps. Your picture does give you some good pictures of what these different things look like. It kind of looks like different scabs in different areas of your body. Infection, you should really know what infection is. There's some kind of pathogen that has entered your body and is causing some kind of drama. Sadly, there's more to the list. Kaposi sarcoma, as we learned previously, a sarcoma is going to be a tumor or a cancerous tumor. And in this case, it gives purple or brown papules, which is a word that we will learn in different areas of the body. It's a common consequence of AIDS. So individuals with AIDS commonly get these little nodules all over them. Laceration is the fancy word for saying kind of a cut. It's torn or jagged-edged wound, so it's not necessarily a clean cut, but you know, you've sliced yourself open, you're bleeding, that kind of thing. A lesion is a generic term for any visible change in the tissue. So because it's so general, if you say you have a lesion, that could be sores, it could be a wound, it could be a tumor, it could be an ulcer. It's just a super generic term for something is not right with your skin. The next word is MRSA infection. MRSA is an acronym. It stands for methicillin, which is an antibiotic, resistant Staphylococcus aureus. So this is one of those nasty bacteria that is resistant to a very common line of antibiotics and can give you different types of infections, can get into the bloodstream, give you pneumonia. It can be fatal if left untreated. It can sometimes be common in hospitals because it can travel around. Next we have pediculosis, fancy word for lice. So the little lice bugs infest your hair. You know the rest. You get the special shampoo, and eventually, you know, 5 to 6 washes later, you are free from pediculosis. Next, we have psoriasis. The P is silent, and it's a very tricky spelling, so be careful. Psoriasis is where you get these silvery scales kind of all over in different parts of your body. You might have seen medication commercials for plaque psoriasis. I think there's some pictures in your book about it too, we'll get to. Next we have scabies, which just sounds gross because it is, oh, I skipped one, I'll come back. Scabies is caused by a mite. So you get this little tiny itch mite that burrows into your skin, and lays eggs, and it gets to be super itchy. I accidentally skipped the word rosacea, which is a pretty common condition. When I hear the word rosacea, I instantly think of rosy cheeks because it's a chronic problem that gives you erythema or a redness of the skin. It can also give you, you know, raised bumps and other things like that. Scleroderma, that's where you have a hardening of the skin. So if your skin gets progressively harder in the connective tissue and other things, that you have scleroderma. We'll get to sclero again when we get to the eye. Squamous cell carcinoma. I had talked before about basal cell carcinoma. This is another form of skin cancer. This is a not so nice kind. It is malignant, similar to basal cell carcinoma. It comes from the layer of the epidermis, but this one is more prone to metastasizing. So having squamous cell is worse. And again, all a result of too much UV exposure out in the sun. Next, we have systemic lupus erythematosus. Whew. Long word, which is why we call it SLE. It's a chronic inflammatory disease that covers a lot of different things. Your skin, your joints, your kidneys. It's really an autoimmune disorder. So your body is kind of attacking itself. That's usually what the term lupus is talking about. And because skin is one of those consequences, you put it here. Tinea is the fancy word for ringworm or athlete's foot. The tinea is a fungal infection, and it could be in your nails, more like athlete's foot, or in between your toes. It can be in your hair, it can be in your skin itself, in all different areas. So normally we call it ringworm or athlete's foot, but tinea in general would be a fungal infection of your skin. Next we have urticaria, fancy word for hives. So when you break out in hives, which are really little itchy bumps called wheals. An individual hive is called a wheal, but when you get a bunch of them together, then you have urticaria. And it's oftentimes associated with allergic reactions, but can go with things like panic attacks and certain diseases, things like that. The last one is vitiligo, and that is when you have white patches on the skin. So the melanin and melanocytes that make melanin in your skin are responsible for producing that pigment that gives you that tannish color. When those particular cells die, then you lose all that pigment and you get kind of white patches. There is a picture in your book as well. So when you get to page like 98 and 99, you can see what a couple of these pictures look like. That's a lot of words, a lot of similar sounding different disorders. Please take a moment, work on the exercises 15, 16, really get an idea of what's going on before we move into the next area. I beg you, please pause now before you continue on. Just as a review, we have a couple pictures here. So A is the actinic keratosis, so that little hardened patch, usually from the sun, but you can always think of sometimes too we get those kind of, it looks like a callus, I would say. B is the not so nice kind, squamous cell carcinoma. C, basal cell carcinoma. So B and C are both types of skin cancer. Not really mentioned, or I might have accidentally skipped it. Melanoma is the worst form of skin cancer, and you can see it in D. It's called that because it appears as a black patch. That's the highly invasive, highly malignant type of skin cancer. And then in E, we have the Kaposi sarcoma. So this is normally one of those consequences of AIDS where you get those purpley brown patches in certain areas of the body. All right. So on the left here, we have what rosacea looks like. So rosacea, I think of rosiness. So you can see how the face here and the cheeks are a little bit rosy. For some reason, I see this picture and think of Santa. On the right-hand side, you have vitiligo. So you can see in different areas or patches where those melanocytes have died, and then we have lost pigment in those areas. All right, so next your book kind of just will eventually launch into surgical terms. But here I just wanted to break it down. There are different kinds of infections or ways you can get your skin infected, whether it's by a bacteria or a fungus or a parasite or a virus. So I just gave you a couple examples of how you would file some of these different diseases under different types of infections. And from your book, here were a couple of those different types. So impetigo was one of those examples of a bacteria. Tinea or ringworm / athlete's foot was one of those examples of a fungus. Scabies was the parasite. And herpes zoster, also called shingles, is a viral infection. To review, superficial skin infection characterized by pustules and caused by staphylococci or streptococci is called. That's a mouthful. Looking at the words staph and strep, that should lead you to understand that it's a bacterial infection. So hopefully then that would lead you to the bacterial type of skin disorder, which is A, impetigo. All right. Whew. Take a break if you haven't already, but we are now moving on to surgical terms. There's not a whole lot of them, but these are the ones that are built from word parts. And so if you think back to the beginning of the chapter, all of these come from putting those together. The first one, biopsy, means a view of life, if you literally translate it. But when we use it in practice, a biopsy really means that you take a piece of tissue that you might think is cancerous, look at it under a slide, and determine if it's actually cancer or not cancer. This happens all the time with skin growths, moles that look irregular, but it's really any organ all over the body. It could be a blood sample, that kind of thing. Next, we have dermatoautoplasty and dermatoheteroplasty. Both of them are surgical repair of the skin. It just determines from where they come from. So auto means self, and hetero means different. These two terms are really used in the context of like a skin graft. So if someone gets burned, for example, you take a piece of skin from another area and move it onto the burned area. So if you're doing that from the same person, like you take a chunk of leg skin and move it onto your arm, that would be a dermatoautoplasty or an autograft. If you're taking it from another person or a cadaver, for example, and putting it on someone else, then it would be a dermatoheteroplasty or allograft. A dermatome, is an instrument used to cut skin. A dermatoplasty is that surgical procedure. It's the repair of the skin. And that's a very generic term that could mean, you know, you're stitching up a laceration or you're doing a facelift. The last two have rhytid as their word root. So those are the wrinkles. So a rhytidectomy means that you are removing wrinkles, or rhytidoplasty means that you're repairing. They can kind of be used interchangeably to both mean facelift. Take a break. We're doing exercise 21, and then we're going to move on to the ones not from word parts. Okay, there's not a whole lot, but these words keep piling up from this whole chapter. Trust me, I know. There's a reason I said personally this is not the most energetic and enthusiastic chapter. First we have cauterization, or cautery as it's called. This is where they use super hot or super cold, or it could be electrical or chemical, to basically zap whatever it is, whether it's a mole or a wart or something. They're going to use some process to zap it off. Cryosurgery is specifically using extreme cold. Usually they actually use liquid nitrogen to, for example, freeze a wart off of your skin. Debridement is when they remove dead tissue from an open wound. So you were in an accident and you have an open wound, or you had a burn, and just surrounding junk and stuff gets in there en route to the hospital. Debridement is really when you take away all of the contamination or already dead tissue and basically clean up the wound. Dermabrasion. A lot of you might do this at home, called microdermabrasion, basically where you scrape the dead skin off of the outer layer of your face or hands or arms. In this case, you're going to remove, skins. It could be scars. Really, that's more of the medical term here. Scars can often leave raised bumps in the scar area. So the doctors basically use a very nice form of sandpaper and slowly begin to sand those away. Excision means to remove something by cutting, whereas incision means that you are cutting into the wound using something sharp. So if you're excising, you're taking it out. If you're doing an incision, you're going in kind of through cutting. Incision and drainage often go together. And this is where you purposefully cut into a skin wound to drain whatever is inside, whether it's pus or water or blood or whatever. But for example, if you had a blister and you purposefully cut into it to kind of drain all of the fluid from the inside. In most instances, it helps it heal faster. Laser surgery. So similar to cauterization, they're using a fancy beam of light to cut at the skin or burn the skin to destroy that harmful tissue. The next one is an eponym. It's named after a person from Wisconsin. He came up with his own type of surgery, so it's called Mohs surgery. And really, it's where you're trying to remove skin cancer. And you take a very tiny kind of outline and then see if you got it all. And if not, then you take another little tiny margin around and see if you got it all, and so on. So it was really a way to minimize the amount of tissue needing to be removed to hopefully minimize scarring. So you're not just, being super cautious and removing a ton of skin just to be safe. This was a way to really take the least amount of skin and still be equally effective. The last word is suturing, which you might know is to stitch up wounds. So if you're doing any stitches, then you are technically doing the action of suturing. There's all different kinds of stitches to do and techniques for suturing, but that's what the word means. All right, take a break. I would recommend exercise 24 or 25. 25 is matching, always easier. And then we're going to go on to the complementary terms. If you don't remember, complementary terms are words that kind of go along with these different diseases and disorders. They're related. It also includes different specialties of people, that kind of thing, in this category. These are the ones from word parts. So we're starting off, dermatologist, dermatology. Pretty straightforward. Dermatology as a profession is abbreviated DERM. All of these are from word parts, so you should be able to put them together. Some of these are from previous chapters. For example, keratogenic. Genic, if we remember, means producing. Leukoderma, we've had before, necrosis, and so on. Some of these terms have to do with where an injection site might be. I can't remember if I have a picture or not, but one of the exercises kind of covers this. Different types of injections need to be put in the skin at different spots. So intradermal would be within the skin, meaning probably in between the epidermis and the dermis, for example, TB tests. Subcutaneous would be under the dermis and epidermis layers. Transdermal would be through the dermis, and they all have their own little abbreviations. So at least use these words once as you're working through some of the different exercises so you're on the page before we get to the ones that are not built from word parts. Here's just a refresher. Again, coccus or cocci has to do with the berry-shaped or circular-shaped bacteria, and they can either be arranged in grape-like clusters or twisted chains. So we have streptococcus and staphylococcus. Again, here are the different modes of injection. So there's intradermal, which is right under that outer layer of skin. Transdermal, which it means through the skin. So that's oftentimes from a patch, and then whatever medicine on the patch goes through the skin and into your system. And then subcutaneous, which is kind of how most of our vaccines are given. You could also call it hypodermic. We have hypodermic needles. That also means the same thing, below the skin. Okay, we are now to the words that are not from word parts. Okay, so first we have alopecia, which is a condition of loss of hair. So if you've ever seen anyone that doesn't have any hair, including your scalp and their eyebrows, then they have alopecia. Bacteria, you can figure that one out. A fancy word for a scar is called a cicatrix. Sounds kind of cool, but it is what it is. Like all not from word parts, you just kind of have to memorize the word. Sometimes it sounds like what it is, and sometimes it doesn't. A cyst is a closed sac with fluid in it. And this is where you get into different nuances of words like blister. Acne is actually considered a cyst because it has, fluid inside. Cytomegalovirus, or CMV, is a virus. It's just one that, can come into your system oftentimes when you're sick, caused by a herpes-like virus. Diaphoresis. So dia means through. In this case, diaphoresis means sweating. So if you are sweating, you are doing diaphoresis. Ecchymosis is escape of blood into the skin. So oftentimes when you get a bruise, you're getting ecchymosis. So that's why you get that blue discoloration, because the blood from the broken blood vessels is kind of going into the skin. It doesn't actually come out. Edema is a puffy swelling. So if you are starting to accumulate fluid, edema is just the generic term for kind of inflammation because of that. Erythema is redness. It can be a general redness in any area, but that's where the urethral piece comes in. Fungus, you can figure that out. Induration is an abnormal hard spot. So if you have like an extra hard patch of skin or the underlying tissue, that's what that's called. Jaundice is also called xanthoderma because it gives you that yellowing kind of skin. And it can also happen in the whites of your eyes, but it's a result of liver problems and you have excessive bile building up, and that's what gives you that color. Keloid is an overgrowth of scar tissue. So sometimes when you do get a scar, if it's bad enough, think of burn victims, it can begin to grow up into a big bumpy scar, which is then why they do that abrasion where they try to scale back or sand down those scars. Leukoplakia is where you have white spots or patches on your mucous membranes, oftentimes like in the inside of your mouth. It could mean cancer, not necessarily. Then we have fancy words for common terms. So we have a macule, which is the fancy word for a freckle. It's a flat, dark spot on the skin. So it's not elevated, it's just a flat, dark dot on your skin. And then we have a nevus, which is a mole. Usually it's like a darkish brown or black. If it is present when you're born, then we call them birthmarks, but you can get them, after you are born. Then we have nodule, which is a small knot-like mass that you can feel, sometimes indicating cancer, but not always. Pallor is paleness, so if someone is, getting sick, they oftentimes look paler, so their pallor has changed. Next we have petechia. Oh, I skipped one. Papule. Papule is a small, solid skin elevation. So this could be a basal cell carcinoma or a skin tag if you've ever had one of those. Petechia or petechial hemorrhaging is a pinpoint skin hemorrhage. So you might see tiny little blood vessels radiating out. Oftentimes in the crime shows, they have petechial hemorrhaging in their eyes. You can see all the red from their blood vessels. That's what that's called. A pressure injury is also called a bed sore. It basically means that the skin has kind of been sat on so long that it starts to cause irritation and a sore. Moving along, we have pruritus, and this is itching. So if your skin is extra itchy for some reason, that would be the term that you would use, pruritus. They actually included this in this edition of the book that wasn't previously there. Purpura is small hemorrhages on the skin, giving purple or red discoloration. So it's blood disorders, or it kind of goes along with the idea of having ecchymosis. Pustule is an elevation of skin that has pus, so that can also be considered acne, or impetigo oftentimes has pus. An ulcer is just when you erode the skin or the mucous membrane. So you can have bed sores giving you ulcers. That's why they're called pressure ulcers. You can have a canker sore, which is technically an ulcer. You can have an ulcer in your stomach. Verruca is a fancy word for a wart. It is an elevation that is caused by a virus, actually. If you didn't know, warts are caused by viruses. Vesicle is a fancy word for a blister. So this could be the shingles, it could be from contact dermatitis or other things, but that's what a vesicle is. Virus, I think you can figure it out. And last but not least, we have wheal, which is a one singular hive. We learned a couple slides ago that a group of hives is called urticaria. Okay, ton of words. Please, please, please try exercise, 32, 33, 34. There's a ton of words here that are all very, very similar sounding, so please take a break, go through them, look at the pictures, see how they're broken down. Here's an example of one of those keloids where you have that overgrowth of scar tissue. In this example, it's from a burn. Here's an example of an ulcer as reduced from a pressure injury. So this person might have been bedridden. Lesions can come in many different categories or severities, as I would say. Primary is just a physical change from a pathological origin. What that means is you have some kind of skin infection from a bacteria or a virus or something. Secondary means that the primary either got worse or you got a burn or something else. Vascular has specifically to do with blood vessels and the loss of blood into surrounding tissues. Those ones are also, more intense. So here's just a couple examples of how those terms might break down into those different categories. Primary are just little changes in the skin, whether it's elevated or not. Secondary really has scars, burning, elevation of scars, ulcers. And then the vascular has to do with blood flowing out of the vessels from breaking or various means. Your book has a pretty good breakdown of the different categories, and I would say this table or group of words might be the hardest to keep straight in the whole book, really. Like, what is the difference between a macule and a papule and a nodule and a pustule and all of those different things? It's going to be hard, so you're really going to need to dedicate a lot of time to this. Or you have a wheal, but then you have a group of wheels, so it's eudicaria. Or you have a furuncle, and a group of those is a carbuncle. It's a lot. I get it. So looking at this, what do we call a birthmark? Do we remember what we call a birthmark? It's the fancy word for mole. If you need to look back, think about what that would be. All right, which one of these means sweating? Unless you're sweating blood into your tissues, C is the correct answer, diaphoresis. It doesn't necessarily mean excessive sweating, it's normal sweating. All right, we're to the end of the book or chapter. We are now to the abbreviations. If you look in your book on page 119, you will find all of the abbreviations that have kind of been sprinkled throughout, so please definitely go through and look at those. Also at the end of every chapter, there's those medical terms and contexts, which I think are really helpful for tying all the different pieces or types of words together. So here are those abbreviations. A lot of them have to do with the different skin cancers that you can have. There's different types of MRSA, whether it's kind of community gotten or hospital gotten, so please take a look at those a little bit. This is one example of what that medical terms and context looks like. You should be able to kind of read through this, pronounce the words correctly, know what they mean, that kind of thing. Here's a couple extra questions related to the text. And that brings us to the end. Again, in the back of the book, there are answers to every single workbook question in the chapter. So please go through those, double check your answers, go through the Quizlets, and so on. This is a very meaty and very difficult chapter.